Namaskar, my name is Purnima, Nath from Wisconsin all the way. Today at Parley with Purnima, we have a wonderful special guest, a prominent British Hindu who is not only professionally successful in IT consulting, but also working for the Hindu community for many decades. And he has been pulled into issues involving Hindus in UK. Welcome, Mr. Satish ji. Thank you so much for your time today. And we are going to directly dive into the issues, Hindu issues involving us in America, and it is the same in UK. And you have done tremendous amount of research, and we would like to learn what happened in UK. It's so much to talk about, your background. One thing that I'd like to start with, you have been awarded with Dharma Rakshak, a Dharma Samrakshak, a custodian of Dharma. I'd like people to understand the difference between Dharma and religion. There is no equivalent in English for Dharma. Let's start our conversation with that. Thank you so much and welcome.
Purnima ji, Pranam ji, Namaskar ji, and good evening or good morning for yourself. And greetings to your audience. Thank you very much for reaching out and for giving me an opportunity to share some of our journey here. Dharma is a wonderful place to start with. Now, there are so many words and ideas which we have managed to create, and our ancestors have given them to us because we have been refining and learning and seeking for tens of thousands of years. So there are some ideas which don't translate so easily. What I've always tried to do is to try and find comparable words which convey the understanding, but also the bhavna, the sentiment. And so if you can share the understanding and the bhavna, then we have an opportunity for other people to really understand who we are and why we are the way we are. So Dharma, let's try and encapsulate it in as few words as possible. Dharma is a darshan. It is something that seekers gained an insight about. So they developed the capacity to look, to search, to try and comprehend, to try and understand deeply. And one of the things that they saw was an incredible interaction of all of life and all of living things. And this is what they termed dharma, the manner in which all of existence coexists, works together, and moves forward on its journey from being Atma, Jivatma, to merging with Paramatma. Now, from our perspective, our ancients were so wise, they realized that inside of us, we have the capacity for Anand. And everybody is seeking Anand. In the Bhagavad Gita, Shri Krishna ji, he says that the delight in a gambler when he wins is me. That I am that Anand in everybody. Whatever it is you experience, that little experience of Anand is actually divine. And so what we understood was that it's possible to exist in Anand all the time, but in a manner which consumes the least resources. And that is what Dharma is. It's how we strive to move from birth to rebirth, and the time in between, we try and heighten the experience of Anand for everything, whilst diminishing the amount of the earth's resources that we consume. Now, the Western model, they're also seeking Anand. When a person takes drugs, he's taking them to seek a connection with a state of Anand, some experience which is heightened and better than their normal mundane experiences they feel it. When somebody is wanting to win an election, the joy of winning an election is a connection to that center of us, which is Anand. If it was suffering, we wouldn't want to win elections. We wouldn't want to be doing these things. When a boxer is in a boxing match and defeats an opponent and experiences euphoria, it's Anand. But they're seeking Anand outside. They're seeking Anand by defeating things outside of themselves. Dharma teaches us to seek Anand, but by venturing inside of ourselves. And so they're the two different approaches to human existence. Our approach, that approach which says that everything can have moment by moment anand and move from birth to rebirth without any suffering. That's what dharma is. Dharma is the way in which all things interact. Swadharma is how each of those little cogs in this incredible machinery, this existence, how each of them coexist, how they work together to support the whole machine to move everything forward. So that's what Swadharma is, the individual's role in the grand scheme of things moving forward. So as you can imagine, that's a very broad and all-encompassing darshan. It's a vision, which is huge. It's far too big to be contained simply in the word religion. So dharma is not religion. Religion is a concept. It's an intellectual construct which was created by Euro-Christians in the Euro-Christian civilizational model. It doesn't apply to us. In fact, it didn't apply to the indigenous people of the North Americas or the South Americas. This notion of religion didn't apply to the African nation. It didn't apply to the Aboriginal nation. All of those civilizations were actually very dharmic. They never wanted to exhaust the earth's resources. They were never so arrogant to assume that you could own a piece of land. You know, they thought, well, our existence is finite. The earth is infinite. It's going to be here after we have gone. How can we own a piece of this magnificent earth? And that was all a dharmic perspective, the view that we're custodians and we're not consumers. Religion is built upon the notion that we're consumers. And we are saying that our understanding is actually that we're custodians and our consumption should be minimal. This is what dharma is. It's a respect and an appreciation for the earth, which gives us our bodies, and the earth which gives all other creatures their bodies. It's an understanding which says if you can't recreate something, don't destroy it. It's beyond our capacity to make, so why on earth should we have the authority to break something? So it really is living with the highest level of understanding on the earth. That's what dharma is.
I've never heard such wonderful explanation of dharma, swadharma, and the role, individual role in the entire existence, and how I like how you connected back to harmonious existence. And that's critical. Yes. That's critical for all of us today. Coexistence has become a new term, but this is not a new term for Hindus. Unfortunately, there is no equivalent term of dharma, but it is living with everybody peacefully, blissfully. You also mentioned about anand of internally and externally and looking for anand everywhere. Well, what's the difference between bliss and anand and peace then? I mean, living peacefully and blissfully, no matter what is going on externally, isn't it?
So peace, again, is one of those words which it doesn't really translate into our lexicon. We have the word shanti, and many people translate that into peace. But shanti doesn't have the, peace doesn't have the bhavna of the word shanti. Shanti actually is better encapsulated and used, if you use the word tranquility, that conveys a much more deeper sense of what shanti means. When you say shanti, 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 you become tranquil. You don't become peaceful. Remember, in the Middle East, there's a peace process that's been going on, which has no shanti and no tranquility in it whatsoever. So shanti is more tranquil. And we are people who have understood that what you put into the world comes from inside of you. If you want to put tranquility into the world, then you need to fill your own being with tranquility. Shanti needs to come from inside of you. And this is why we always turn to work on ourselves. Our tradition says we are self-evolving beings, that we are capable of working on mind, body, atma in such a manner that we evolve into much more civilized, much more anand-infused beings. Bliss is one of those words which again is in the English language, but bliss for me feels spaced out. You know, there's a bliss, a sense of bliss, which is, it's not, it doesn't translate very well. Anand is tranquil, quiet, self-absorbed. You know, you see the picture of Bholenath, Shiv Shankar, and there's a tiny smile. His attention is inwards as well as outwards, right? There is no dependence upon anything, not even clothing, mundane possessions. He's sitting in ice-encased mountainous regions, and yet completely in a stage of anand. And that's different to bliss. But we're getting there. We're now finding the English language words, and we're creating the vocabulary to be able to share with people, not just an understanding, but a sentiment. When we successfully manage to convey it, they feel it. And that's what we're now beginning to develop in the English language. We're developing how we can share and communicate these perspectives and these understandings. And it's wonderful. People like yourself, people like myself, we're blessed to have a foot in two cultures. We're blessed to be able to take from one and contribute it into another. It's such a valuable responsibility and a valuable blessing. So we have to do more and more of this.
I think it's you answered it quite eloquently. It's wonderful how you differentiated Shanti and peace, Anand and bliss. And interestingly speaking, going back to our targeted topic today, you mentioned how Euro-Christian indoctrination really didn't align with our dharma. This constant and continuous attack on dharmas, like Hinduism, which is the last on earth at this point, the attack doesn't seem to end. Today we are talking about this, one of those attack called caste. And today my goal is to make sure that people of Western country understands that caste was created to dominate Hindus and India and also rule over Hindus. So if you could educate us on that, that'll be awesome. Thank you.
It is necessary and it's timely. I would just say that your audience are probably wondering, this man must have such a boring life that he would write a book on caste, right? Why on earth, what would possess a person to write a book about caste? I never wanted to write a book. I said this many times that I think there are more than enough books on the earth. And as far as human beings need, we have wonderful, especially if you're from a dharmic background, we have vast libraries, everything that is needing to be written for human well-being, for diminishing suffering, it's already been written. But the situation here in the United Kingdom arose such that it was necessary for me to be able to understand what caste was, when it occurred, and whether it was something which afflicted the Sanatani Bharatiya Indic civilization. Where did it occur? On the one hand, it was obvious that it was completely at odds with our deepest philosophies. Our deepest philosophies say very clearly that we are Jivatma, that each and every one of us is spirit incarnate, and that the packaging is not what identifies us and we don't identify with it. If that's the case, then how on earth did we become confused with identity politics based upon jati, varna, caste, kul, and so on and so forth? So this needed to be understood and established. And the reason it needed to be understood was that evangelical Christians here in the United Kingdom suddenly tried to pass a law saying that 1 in 2 Hindus was discriminating against each other in the United Kingdom. And this was raised in the House of Lords, it was raised in the House of Commons, and it went back and forth. But the exercise was conducted in a manner which demonized and vilified Hindus per se. Now, you may be aware in the United Kingdom, there has been a problem for a long period of time where one particular community who are engaged in grooming gang activity, as it's called, where gangs of people come together and they find vulnerable young girls, largely British girls, and they either kidnap them or they coerce them into acts which then they can be blackmailed with. It's abuse on a vast scale. And the statistics that were put forward indicated that, I think 80% plus of all grooming gangs cases involve the Pakistani Muslim men. And this is published material. This is nothing that I'm sort of saying myself. It's in the public domain. But in the United Kingdom, newspapers don't report that. What they say is an Asian grooming gang. And so by using the word Asian, you conceal the fact that it was predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. And the argument that's always been presented is that, well, not all Pakistani Muslim men engage in this activity. And so by identifying it as Pakistani Muslim men, you are actually tarnishing a whole community. And so we're going to refer to it as Asian. Now that logic should have been equally applied when they spoke about this issue. But hold on a minute, we should say that this is an Asian problem, because not all Hindus engage in caste discrimination, but they didn't do that. At every second sentence, Hindu this, Hindu that. It was an exercise in defamation and vilification and humiliation of a community. Now, the worrying thing is that whenever this happens, there is a history of dehumanization prior to oppression. That before you want to oppress somebody, you have to dehumanize them. You have to reduce them to an identity as opposed to human beings, of mothers, fathers, sisters, children, businessmen, people who have families, who have feelings, who have loyalties, all of those incredible things that make us a human being. You have to strip all of those away and reduce the person to a very shallow, dehumanized identity. And that's what was done to us in the Houses of Parliament by the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And they had no data to back it up at all. This was an exercise in oratory. This was an exercise in rabble rousing. This was an exercise in incitement to hatred. And it was a shock to us. And the allegation that was leveled against us was that Hindus in Britain had brought the terrible Hindu caste system to this country, and that we had to have legislation to protect those poor people who are low caste, and that protection must be put into law. It struck me that, one, this wasn't true, that the people who were putting this forward, we found out, were actually Dalit activists who were associated with missionary Christian evangelical movements in India. They had come to the United Kingdom and had visited several temples and Gurdwara, Sikh temples, and started a process of making complaints and causing friction. And it was those complaints which formed the basis of evidence, which the parliamentarians said, this is evidence that 1 in 2 Hindus, half of all Hindus, are discriminating against the other half in this country. A complete and utter fabrication. Now, you know that when you have no data, when you have no reliable evidence, and you want to perpetrate or inflict an injustice, you have to do it by leveraging emotions. And so that's what happened. The parliamentarians made speeches which were worthy of Shakespearean drama. There were flourishes, and the emotions were raised, and then they were calmed, and then they were raised again. It was a masterful display of incitement. Fortunately, we understood what was happening at the time. And because I'd been involved in Samaj Seva for a long period of time, I'd worked with mandirs up and down the country. And I knew our Shastra, scripture, itihasa, and our philosophies. And I knew that this was not something that was ours, but where did it come from? So I started digging, I started doing my research. And I'm blessed with, on my journey, I have picked up many ancient books. My interest was always in ancient scriptures, but also in ancient history books. And so I was in possession of a number of records written by Europeans in Bharat around the time of partition. I was quite interested in that period of history. And I was also interested in the religious dimensions of the British Raj, as it's called, or how it should really be called, the British occupation, the British illegal occupation of India, because that's what it was. And during that time, how religion interacted with Bharat was something that I was always interested in. So I had access to a lot of records. In addition to that, we have access to Hansard, the records of the British Parliament going back to the 1800s and even earlier, as well as access to the British Library and other records. So I started tracking down this thing called caste. Most people know that caste is a Portuguese word. It's not a word which is native to Bharat. But what most people don't know is behind the word caste, there is a concept. And the concept is a class structure which is hereditary, hierarchical, and endogamous. So it means that there are classes who are above each other, that people marry within their own class, and you inherit your right according to the class that you were born in. Okay, now let's get this really crystal clear. The British royal monarchy is a caste system. The whole notion of blue bloods, the royal blood, all of these things, they are indicators of a caste system. And in fact, the word caste in Portuguese, it merely means class. It means a class system. And we know that European Christian nations have always had a class system. Even to this day, the Prime Minister will bow in front of Her Majesty the Queen. Right? This is caste. They are a high caste, and people beneath them are lower castes. In addition to that, we have the Commonwealth, which is a huge global organization. It has a hereditary head. Isn't that casteist? Right, that is a classic caste indicator, a hereditary, a hierarchical, endogamous structure. But in Bharat, we have never had a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous structure. And this needs to be noted. You know, we have more than enough examples of it. So I wanted to find out at which point did the social structure which plagues Bharat today, how did it arrive? Where did it come from? Who created it? Was it accidental? Was it a decline in our society? Or was it an act of mischief? That is what I really needed to know. And so what I found was, yes, it was an act of mischief. It was conceived, planned, sculpted, and architected by Christian missionaries. And the date that they really decided that this had to be done was the 4th of January, 1844. Okay, so I'm putting out there, and I'm more than happy for people to scrutinize the data and challenge and refute it. This is how scholarship proceeds. Some completely incompetent scholars have been professing and proliferating this nonsense called the Aryan invasion theory. And there is no evidence of it except the might of a PR and marketing empire which had proliferated that idea. I'm putting forward a theory based on evidence which says that the caste system that India is plagued by was architected and deployed on the 4th of January, 1844. There was a conference of Christian missionaries on that date. And during that conference, they identified, one, that the jati structure of Bharat was so integrated, was so self-sufficient, that it was proving impenetrable to missionary activities. And in it, they talk about everything to do with jatis. So they talk about how people worship their tools. They talk about how each jati has its own deity, how carpenters have Vishwakaramji, the architect of the devas, how jewelers have Kuber, and so on and so forth. And because all of these self-contained building blocks of the Bharatiya society were so stable, were so self-contained, they needed to be destroyed specifically so missionaries could then start to convert. This is clearly stated in the records of that meeting. So one, they identified that jatis were a problem. At that point in time, the word caste was used for jati. In that conference, caste is used again and again, and they are clearly referring to jatis. Okay? And they say at that time, they identified this as a problem. And in fact, there was a bishop, Father Roberts, I think his name was, and he said that the one thing betwixt Christ and these pagans is this incredible institution of India called caste. That was his statement, and that's a direct quotation from his notes. This is what he announced to this gathering. So they identified that that was the problem. Now, further to that, we have lots of census records. And you have to remember that at that time, the white Christian missionaries who were in Bharat, who were occupying India, they were intent upon conquering it and saving the heathen. They had done all of this throughout Europe. Remember, they erased Europe's pagan traditions right across the whole continent. They erased the pagan traditions of the Americas and of Australia. And your colleagues over there in America may be aware of the missionary schools in Canada and of the horrific atrocities that were inflicted upon the children of Native Americans when they were torn away from their parents and locked up in these missionary schools and brainwashed and indoctrinated. It was stated policy to beat the Indian out of these children and make them into civilized people. And this is exactly what they were doing in India. It was the same mindset that came to India. In fact, if you read their notes, there are some of the most ridiculous, horrific theories. They came up with one theory that a person's level of civilization could actually be measured by the bridge of your nose. So the narrower the bridge of your nose, the more civilized you were, and the flatter the bridge of your nose, the closer you were to animal. And this was a widely accepted theory at that time. It was proliferated, and people seemed to think, oh yes, this is a good idea. This is how foolish these people were. When they came to Bharat, they found there a civilization which had attained heights that they could never have aspired to nor dreamed of. Even today, the West is confirming with science that the findings of Ayurveda and Yoga Bhyasa have value. And yet these were mastered by us and recorded by us 5,000 years ago, when most Europeans were beating each other up over the head with the thigh bone of an antelope, wearing animal skins, running around in woods. And so there was a vast gulf between the pirates who came to Bharat, because they were by and large pirates. And they came to Bharat, they found a civilization of civilized, tranquil human beings who were existing. I think one of the quotations was that Hindus are of the earth, but they don't live on the earth. It was because they had a set of morals which was completely alien to these people who were materialistic. This is recorded in many, many records. So this is the group, this is the civilization that this group of missionaries found in Bharat. Now imagine what a conflict they must have faced. Okay, on the one hand, they had been traipsing all over Europe, destroying pagans, drowning women. The healing arts in Europe were mostly in the hands of women. The women were the ones who carried the knowledge and passed it through to children. They were the ones who knew about the herbs and everything else. They were the ones who had a lot of power and respect. And that was obviously a threat to the church, the churches of empire. And so they drowned and burned at the stake most of the wise pagan traditions, mostly women. And then they encountered India, where there was a civilization which was so much more advanced than anything they could even conceive and understand. Now they had a choice. Either they went back to Europe and said, guys, we got it wrong. We have found a civilization which is actually a lot smarter than we are. Right? They have measured the distance from the earth to the sun, and they did it, when we were saying that in fact the earth is at the center of the universe and the sun goes around it. Right? And these guys had calculated the distance between the earth and the sun. They didn't do that, because if they had gone back to Europe and said, we have found a better truth, we have found a higher set of values, it would mean they had been lying for the best part of 1400 years. That all of those people that they had sacrificed on the altar of their own ignorance That's just nothing other than murder. It's genocide. It's civilizational ethnocide. And that's how they'd established their power in Europe. They came to India, found a better solution, found a better set of ideals, found a higher level of civilization. And if only they had made the right decision. You know, European Christians, they tend to project themselves, certainly in the institutions, as though they're a little bit like Captain Kirk and the crew of the Starship Enterprise, that, you know, if you come across a new civilization, a new alien planet, you mustn't interfere, right? That no, we're custodians and let them develop, and we're not going to interfere. But that's not what they were like. You know, there is sometimes a sense that the institutions present themselves like Mary Poppins, you know, or Nanny McPhee as the teacher who is nurturing children. When the reality, when you scrape under the facade, suddenly you come across Hannibal Lecter, when you really begin to understand the psyche of these people. This is who came to Bharat, and they decided that they had to destroy this civilization because it presented a threat to their religious institutions and their royal monarchy-based power structures. And that's what they set out to do. Now imagine if you are coming back to England, right, and you've got this civilization over there that you're setting about destroying it, you're not going to tell the people who you've come back to, wow, we found a great civilization. No, what you're going to tell them is they're uneducated, horrible people, they're savages, right, and we have to civilize them. So please, can you give us more money so we can go there and civilize them? That way, you have your, in Punjabi, we would say, dono haathon mein laddu. Right? You take from one side and you take from the other side and you lie to both. And the European populations have been lied to by the institutions of European power about their own European history. Most of the white Christian European populations have no reality, no understanding of what their power structures did in order to establish white European Christian power. They don't know, or we have to tell them. One of the things they did in Bharat, in order to justify enslaving, slaughtering, murdering, killing, raping, butchering, everything, they had to tell everybody else that these are savages. And that's what they did. And a fundamental part of it was they had to tell everybody in the West that one of the terrible things they have is a part of their religion, and it's this thing called caste. Now, there are records in my book where I prove that European authors on the ground at the time expressed, one, how they deliberately created caste, two, that it was a knowing act of malice, and three, that they could see in front of them that the problems it was causing. There was a census officer in India on the northwest frontier called R.L. Middleton, who recorded in the census notes, he was instructed to find everybody's caste. And he said, well, you know, what we think of as caste, I asked them, what's your caste? And they don't know. But he also wrote that this terrible thing called caste, this system called caste that we abhor, we are largely responsible for its creation. And he wrote this in his census notes. And this was in 1921, where he recorded this, accepted responsibility for caste. And he is not alone. There are many others who have also written and recorded that the caste system was created by Euro-Christian missionaries with the intention of justifying the atrocities that they inflicted upon pagans and heathen. One thing is missing. If you are going to blame the religion because you want to convert these people, you have to tie this terrible thing called caste to religious scripture. Now, in religious scripture, they found Varna. And they said, fantastic. What we will do is shoehorn all of the Indians into the 4 Varnas. We will tell everyone that Varna is caste, and then we can blame it on the Hindu religion. And then we can take this religion apart. And when we take it apart, we can replace it with our chosen identity, i.e. a Christian identity. Many of your listeners, they may have come across Lord Macaulay. He's the one who spelt it out the most beautifully. He said it very simply: we want to create a class of Indians who are brown on the outside, but internally their morals, their values and everything else is purely British. They wanted to create what we call Macaulay's minions, and they were very successful. There are a vast number of Indians who have no idea that the British not only colonized the land, but they colonized the people as well. When a person becomes colonized, they become occupied, they become infected with an ideology and an identity which is alien to them. They aspire to be what the white man wants them to be, so the white man will give them approval. This is not just in Bharat, this is the African American experience. You know, in America, they had this character who was called the N word is no longer used, but he was called a house N word. And we have house Hindus, right? We have those exactly the same. They're Hindus who have been elevated by an external occupier, given privilege, given security, given power on the condition that they betray their own ancestors and their own motherland. And we have them in abundance. They are very easily identifiable. And so there are groups of people now who are working with a colonial ideology. They are implementing a clearly stated colonialist plan to deconstruct and wipe out the last surviving dharmic civilization on the planet. It's clear, it's stated, it's recorded. And this is what we're facing now. When I studied and researched this, I was shocked that the House of Lords, which contains the high and the mighty, wouldn't understand that human rights legislation says that every human is born equal. This is a fundamental part of human rights. And yet what they were trying to say is everyone is born equal except Hindus, right? Because Hindus are born casteist. What a load of nonsense. My son, who was born in this country, who has been educated in the United Kingdom and been through the school system, the legislation they wanted to pass would say he wasn't equal in front of the law. That because of his surname, because of his ancestors, but most importantly, because of his religion, he cannot be relied upon to be an equal, decent person. Isn't that discrimination? To say to somebody that by birth you are lower than everyone else, and in the eyes of the law, you do not have the equal right to be treated as innocent until proven guilty, like everybody else does. How ridiculous can that be? In the name of equality legislation, you are denying people the right to equal treatment in front of the law. And that is the fundamental part of this whole issue, which is bad law. Now, the legislators here in the United Kingdom, we manage, using much of the information that's in the book that I've had to publish, and the education of our own community. We educated our own community about what was really going on, and they came together and challenged this legislation on the basis of the evidence and on the basis of their own experience. They hadn't experienced caste discrimination like we were being accused of. And so on those bases, we managed to convince the legislators that this was bad law, because it clearly is. And it's such a bad law. It's exactly the same as the draconian laws that the Nazis put in place against the Jewish community when they set about dehumanizing that community prior to the horrific acts that were then perpetrated upon them. It's the same process. Dehumanize, pass legislation which does not give them the same equality and protection under the law, and then when something terrible happens to that community, people will justify it and say, well, they were those terrible castists. That's the colonialist scheme. It was implemented in Bharat in the 1800s. It was implemented in Australia in the 1800s. It was implemented throughout the Americas in the 1800s. Laws were passed which denied human beings equality in front of law. And it's now being leveraged against the Hindu community in the 21st century. Now, as a community, the American Hindu community need to understand that there is no dearth of understanding. Right? The legislators, they should know what equality is. They should know that in the United Kingdom, we have a statue And it's a lady whose eyes are blindfolded. She represents jurisprudence. And the fact that she's blindfolded means that she sees no difference between one human being and another human being. The law is blind. What this piece of legislation does is it breaks that principle. It says to Madam Jurisprudence, right, that you should be blind to everybody else and treat them all equally, except Hindus, because Hindus are terrible people and they are born with a proclivity, a tendency to be prejudiced. Now, isn't that horrific? And that is what you're facing. And it strikes me as an incredible irony that the land, you know, what is it? The home of the brave and the land of the free, or is it the land of the brave and the home of the free? The land which was built on the bones of black people, soaked in the blood of brown people, now has legislators who are occupying that land, and they're passing judgment on brown people again from a different country in a different land. The hypocrisy of it is just unbelievable. It's extraordinary. But here's what the challenge is that's in front of you. You need to be able to share these ideas with these legislators, because I'm certain, hand on heart, that the majority of legislators are innocent and ignorant of history. The majority of people who are in positions of authority, especially in Western European Christian countries, have been fed a cocktail of fictitious history. Most of it was architected and sculpted by the institutions, religious institutions of Europe. That would be the religious institutions being the Church of England and indeed the Church of Rome. The histories that have been taught to most European and American legislators bear no resemblance in reality. And so you are faced with the challenge of educating them of what the reality behind this is. And if you manage to do that, I am sure that you will not find legislators who will deliberately and knowingly pass what is bad law, because bad law always comes back to bite people. And bad law, this is bad law. It represents an existential threat to the Hindu community, the Hindu American community, and it puts you all in a corner. When you put a community into a corner, an existential corner, that community will fight to survive. And why on earth would you want to create that sort of inter-community disharmony? So this is bad law, and you're faced with the task of educating, guiding, and indeed lobbying the legislators so they do not pass bad law. And this is what caste is about, and this is the subject of my book. The book contains all of the ammunition that you're going to need. It contains all of the evidence you're going to need, but it's also a record of the strategy that we adopted here in the United Kingdom. And take my word for it, you may think that, well, that's the United Kingdom and this is the United States and we have a different way of doing things. I'm sorry. The drivers which are making this, which are causing this friction are the same drivers. The challenges that we faced and how we responded to them are the same challenges that you're going to face. And so the strategy is laid out there, and I'm hoping that by publishing this, I will save you all 2 years of research, and you can benefit from the research that we had to do here and use it to restore inter-community harmony, to diminish this recipe for inter-community friction and discord. And so it's pretty much there. One last thing before I give my voice a pause is that the reason I published this book was in response to Isabel Wilkerson's book called Caste, right? We know what the British did to us by imposing and socially engineering to make this recipe for eternal strife a part of the Hindu psyche, part of the Indian civilizational psyche. We know what was done to us. One of the things that we've always done, and Hindu saints have been doing this for generations, for millennia, introducing equality, reintroducing equality, reforming any social aberrations. We've always had it built into us. So what we've been doing is we've been consciously, on an ongoing basis, dissolving caste consciousness. This is the key. We have dissolved caste consciousness that was imprinted upon our ancestors here in the United Kingdom. Our third generation have no idea of this thing, or they had no idea until Lord Harris, Bishop Lord Harris of Pendergarth, started to push it into their understanding. What we have to do is dissolve caste consciousness. What Isabel Wilkerson in her book, what she did is she reversed all of our efforts on dissolving caste consciousness by proliferating it. And for that, she can never be forgiven. Her book, I've studied it, her book is a classic example, and it should be a warning to any author to be wary of confirmation bias. She fell foul of exactly what the legislators are trying to make happen. She presumed she knew. Her research was shallow. She didn't ask people who might have been able to say to her, well, actually, there's another side to this story. Her research was appalling. And what she did is she put the word caste into the mind of every single person. She needs to be made to understand that for Hindus, caste is a C word. It's a hate brand. It's a word created to inspire hatred and contempt for Hindus. That's what it is. It's a colonialist trope in the same way as the N word is for African Americans. When somebody wants to diminish, denigrate, and vilify and dehumanize an African American, they would use the N word. When somebody wants to do that to a Hindu, they use the C word. I call it the caste bomb in some of my talks. And for a woman of African American descent to be doing the work of the white supremacist, the colonialist, is a tragedy. And so because of this, I chose to publish this book. It was in response to Oprah and Isabel Wilkerson and the manner in which they have harmed our community. Bharat is on its own journey of decolonization. We're recovering from the best part of 400 years of white European Christian supremacy, of the worst kind. Similar to that was exactly what was done to the African Americans and the North American Indians. And so our journey is underway, and it's a tragedy that one group who are decolonizing and trying to recover from the insanity which was behind the horrors inflicted upon them would actually become party to it with regard to another group who were on the same journey of recovery and reintegration of indigenous identity. So somewhere along the line, we're going to have to educate Isabel and indeed Oprah. Oprah should have known better. I'm afraid not on the money this time, Oprah. So this is why I've written the book. This is why I published it. And I would, it's not a huge book. I deliberately wanted to keep it to less than 100 pages so that any child could read it, so that any student could read it, so that you wouldn't have to go through 400 pages of academic heavy tomes. It's light, it's easy, and it contains everything you need to know for this issue. And I have called it, I do write on across the top of it, it contains what every Hindu and every Christian needs to know about caste. I challenge any Christian who is following the gospel of Christ to read the book and then declare that they do not feel a sense of responsibility to reverse this civilizational harm.
I'm laughing, Satish ji, or actually smiling, because the same entity that created a social evil called caste and entrusted upon the Hindus are the same ones trying to recreate it here in the Western country just to vilify and dehumanize our people in our community here.
Yeah. It's the same boring old strategy. Once you start to investigate it and you find the evidence, it's actually straight out of the colonialists' textbook. This is classic divide and rule. One thing these white supremacist Christianists are superb at is genocide by proxy or ethnocide by proxy. And in Punjabi, we would say it's the equivalent of putting your gun on somebody else's shoulder to shoot somebody, right? So you stand behind somebody, you use their shoulder, and then you shoot the person. And this is what these institutions are so good at doing. They're so masterful at finding somebody else to pull the trigger, to inflict the civilizational harm, so that they can stay behind the scenes and declare that no, 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 we are better and we are superior and we don't do this. But it's worth remembering also that the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, is on record for having given now 99 apologies in different parts of the world in response to the responsibility that that institution faces with regard to causing ethnocide, genocide, and causing societal discord. And it's the same thing that's happening here. We have a group of our own brethren who don't know how they were isolated, how they were ostracized. The Dalit community actually have not yet traced their own history beyond the clouds of the British occupation of India. If they trace their history, it disappears in a black hole of British occupation. Prior to that, most of them do not know what their own history was. And in my book, I reveal who they were and what their own history was. And so, again, members of the Dalit community who read the book, they too have been deeply, deeply hurt and moved at how they had been manipulated. Christian friends and colleagues of mine who have read the book have expressed their horror. A dear friend of mine wrote, he said, I can give you an assurance that the vast majority of British Christians have no idea that this is what happened. We were told in churches and in school time and time again that caste was a part of the terrible Hindu religion and that we were actually acting to save those people. And now that he'd read it, he concludes with, please forgive us so that we can move forward together. And this is what we have to achieve. We have to make people understand that there are many, many victims in this particular issue. And it would be a terrible thing if those who have been hurt by this don't recognize that there is a mischievous hand which wanted to hurt them. It wanted to deconstruct this family. It wanted to bring friction and discord into a family. And they did it successfully. It's upon us now to undo that harm. And a significant part of it is to create boundaries. And let's challenge the people who would want to continue to dehumanize us like this.
I came across a new terminology recently called civil society. I was not aware of before, and I did reach out to USAID as well. And I have some documentation. We have to do some research and digging into it, what it is. And I understand the churches are part of civil society. But it strikes me that today Hindus are called as heathens, kafirs, and infidels, and somebody else have the responsibility to teach and lecture the Hindus worldwide how to live their life. The reason we wanted to talk, and this particular talk is quite crucial and timely, because summer 2020, I came across the lawsuit against Cisco. I'm sure you've heard about it. It was on Caste. As I digged into it, I found out that both the Dalits, the one who persecuting is actually not even applied for the job. So how can you expect to get a job if you have not applied? That's what's a question. But it has nothing to do with caste. But these organizations whose Christians, Dalit groups, nothing to do with Hinduism, they're imposing it is on caste. It's a caste issue. It was the case was dismissed in federal court. It was reinstated in Santa Clara County. And I came across it last month when they were having a shallow discussion. A red carpet was rolled out to these groups, a fraudulent fudged report, and there was no communication and conversation and involvement from the Hindu community at large. Quite concerning, and that's how you came into the picture, because you have gone through this.
Yeah, and it's the features are the same, Purnima. They're exactly the same over here. By and large, it must be understood that the Hindu community is a self-regulating, self-disciplining community. Here in the United Kingdom, we are 2% of the population, We contribute 6% to GDP. We have the lowest profile in terms of Hindus in prison. We have one of the highest profiles when it comes to successful marriages. We have one of the highest profiles when it comes to our own ownership of our own homes. We are a model society. And it's not because we have learned anything from Britain where we are, because it's the same profile everywhere. And it's because we carry a civilizational ethos, which is connected to an ancient civilization which understood how to live in harmony on the earth. Right? Our ancient, well, even when I say ancients, 2 generations ago, our parents and grandparents, whoever it was who came to these diaspora, we became diaspora in foreign countries, they couldn't read the law, they didn't know the constitution, they didn't know the human rights legislation that was passed or anything like that, and yet they self-managed. Right? This is a big pointer that our community does not need white saviors. Our community does not need brown saviors. And the only people who really have a right to be able to dictate to us without being ranked hypocrites are those whose own communities are contributing to society and to the exchequer and to the revenue in the manner in which our communities were. I've just shared that we're 2% contributing 6%. Imagine if all of the British population were working with the same civilizational rules and drivers. We would see a 300% increase in GDP. Isn't that worth sort of trumpeting? But no, what's happening, the converse is happening, in that we are contributing way above our own weight, and other communities are actually accusing us of being guilty of things that we are not guilty for. You know, we have to understand that this is the reality, and our community have got one other thing to do. And they don't do it very quickly. And I think it's partly because our civilizational identity, our civilizational psyche has been traumatized for the best part of 1400 years. I think it was 700 AD when the first, 711 AD when the first Turkish Islamists, as they're called nowadays, descended with their violence and their hordes on Bharat. And since that time, our civilization has been under threat. You know, whether it was going through the times when Churchill starved Bengal and 4 million people died as a direct result of a white Christian's decision. And most of what he stole from Bharat, it was wasted. It didn't go to support anyone. It rotted in warehouses in Europe. So, you know, there are a huge number of these incidents where our community suffered. And as a result, we went into survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, you keep your head down. You work double the hours, you work twice as hard as everyone else. You know, you reestablish credibility by service. And we have been doing that, but it hasn't given us a platform where we can say we are now recovered. So we are still recovering, and most of us are still in survival mode. But when you are attacked, survival mode and appeasement mode, history teaches us, does not work. When you do something because you have to, it's already too late. You know, there's an old, I'm full of these Punjabi village sort of quotes, but there's an old Punjabi quote that you don't dig a well when your house is on fire. It's too late. And we need to recognize, and somebody should notice, your community should notice, this happened to us here in the United Kingdom 4 or 5 years ago. And the same thing is happening to you over there. Is this coincidence? Of course, it's not coincidence. This is a design. And once it's happened in Santa Clara, it will happen throughout the States, because there is a design behind it which does not want the Hindu community to wake up to the fact that it's being oppressed again. And so we have to do this. Otherwise, there is no future. There is no future for the Bharatiya Hindu community. And what is it that will be lost? Our community is the only community that says human beings have a head and a heart, and we're seekers, and we seek Anand, and we seek love and affection, and we seek to support all of humanity. This is what our ethos is. Isn't it a valuable thing to have freedom of thought and freedom of feeling? Nobody to tell you what you should be thinking or what you should be feeling. This is at the root of our civilization. that the human being is such an incredible creation of divinity that if it is allowed to flourish naturally, it grows into the most beautiful creature on the earth, which is why we've never had a theocracy. We've never had dictators who say, God is speaking to you through me. We have had a complete spiritual democracy. And that is a really valuable tradition which is under threat. And that is what is being targeted. And it's time, it's now the 11th hour for our community everywhere to recognize that this is a challenge, to recognize that one of the targets of this vilification and dehumanization is our own children. There is a distinct strategy to make them feel ashamed of their ancestors, to make them feel they want to distance themselves from their roots of being part of the terrible Hindu caste system. This is a conscious strategy, and we have to prevent this from happening because it's a lie. It's a strategy that those same terrible colonialists who wreaked havoc, who judged that people who were brown and not Christian were actually part of the animal kingdom, that they were fauna and flora and not humans and they didn't have souls. These are the maniacs who created this whole caste ideology. We need to share it. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if we become museum piece relics like many of the Native Americans are, but they have no land, they have no solid footing, they're in concentration camps, which are called reservations, another classic colonialist trick. And so we have to do this now. And otherwise, in 2 generations, it'll be too late.
Earlier you mentioned about Oprah, that you couldn't accept her siding with the caste tropes, but she has shown us in United States who she is, a race baiting billionaire, the country that made her billionaires today. She is tearing the country's fabric apart. So she's siding with Isabel Wilkerson, with caste and the origin of discontent, let's say, and sending the book to all media, as well as 500 top CEO, which is most of them are Indian, American. I'm not surprised why she's doing so. But it is our Hindu named Indian American CEOs like Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella who are puppets of those institutions are failing to stand for their dharma.
Here's something.
And that's concerning to me.
Well, it's simple to understand. If you have found success by playing with the rules and according to the rules of a society which is deeply sick. Let me just repeat that. If you have found success by going along with the rules of a society which is deeply sick, then you're not going to question that society. You are part of it. And this is the difficulty. Many of our Indians value success as measured by very sick colonialist societies. And in the United Kingdom, we have Hindus who long for Her Majesty to invite them to Buckingham Palace so she can say, you are now a member of the British Empire and you can put MBE behind your name. But once you know what the British Empire was and how terrible it was and the horrors that it inflicted on the rest of the world for a tiny pirate little island on the edge of civilization of Europe, right? They wreaked human suffering on a scale which is beyond any other scale. And so why on earth would you want to be recognized as a member of that British Empire? You know, the tears of the children in Bengal demand that Hindus say, no, we do not endorse this. We do not give it the badge of credibility. And yet there are people who aspire to those things. And so in time, the more and more of us who start to speak openly about what was done to us, about the reality of the history, and also about who we are prior to the British version of our history, the better it is for everybody. We can't any longer stay quiet just for the sake of fitting in, just for the sake of being, friendly and non-controversial and non-confrontational. We tried that. We tried to keep quiet in all of these societies and to work within them and to raise them and to invest in them. Right? Remember, when we came to this country, they had no notion of what real food was. And now we have more Indian restaurants in London than I think in Mumbai. Right? They came to Bharat because of spices. Right? People went from Europe to Bharat because of spices, not because Europeans had discovered spices, but because they discovered a civilization which had worked out the therapeutic and health-related benefits of spices. And so they came to that civilization to learn and to acquire those things, or to steal and to exploit, as it turned out. Right? So we have to tell these stories so that we can bring back balance to humanity. At the moment, all of humanity has been knocked of its civilizational and spiritual evolutionary trajectory. And so it needs to be brought back. We need to make sure that the voices in the land where you're doing your Karam and your Karam Bhumi, as it were, there are indigenous voices there whose stories have been so gagged and they are now beginning to speak. I love to listen to some of the African American leaders now who are beginning to talk about what the British did to them, about what the French did to them. But the essence of it all is it's what white Christians have done. And so we need to have this conversation. Fitting in doesn't serve us. I'd like to just share one last thought. In the Mahabharata, there is a stage when Krishnji goes as a Shanti Dut to Hastinapur. He's sent by the Pandavas and they say, look, to avoid war, all we want is give us 5 villages, 1 little village for each of the brothers, and we can avoid a huge war. That's all we want. We'll forget what you have done to us. We'll forget your many attempts to kill us. We'll forget the insults and the humiliation that you have heaped upon us. Just to avoid war, give us 5 villages. And Duryodhan says no. And he says no because Duryodhan recognizes that the dharma, the knowledge that the Pandavas carry, sooner or later they will become successful. They will become popular. They will become loved. And his view of existence will be defeated. So he is threatened by their identity. And so he will not accept peace. Our community would need to recognize that the missionary movements in both missionary Abrahamic traditions are threatened by the dharmic perspective of existence. So we need to get ready to engage and to educate and to teach very, very quickly. And that falls on your and my generation now. We have to do this work. And this caste is a great opportunity. This caste issue is a great opportunity to tell all of our stories. Once we tell our stories, if we do it skillfully, and we do it in a dharmic manner, which is what our blood carries within us, to do it in a manner which is loving, respectful, and we're civilizational builders. We build civilizations. We don't deconstruct them like other ideologies do. But what it needs us to do now is to step up, recognize that it's a 5 villages moment, and our response is to engage on the battlefield of knowledge and of words and of activism and of lobbying, and to start to talk to people so that our story resets the balance and reintroduces courtesy and respect for us. That's what you're facing. And you have all of my support and encouragement, and whatever I can give to you and share with you, you can count on it. Let's do this over there in the States. It's necessary now.
What concerns me, Satishji, is our house is burning right now, and we're still on an educational journey. We're just starting. It will take years. What I'm more concerned about it is Santa Clara County being engaged in their public discourse, the talks that happened in the last couple of weeks. I got a sense that they already know what they're going to do, how they want to pass this resolution, and it's coming from the Santa Clara County HRC, Human Rights Council. There is no stop them. They are not listening to the facts. The same way the democratic cities, I wouldn't necessarily say democratic cities, Democrat cities in America had passed multiple anti-CAA resolution. It didn't matter how much fact and data was given to them. It was all pushed out. It was sidelined. People were not respected in a sense that their side of the story was not taken into consideration. It is by design. They know exactly how it's going to play out, because once this goes through, all the Democrat cities are going to pick this up. And the next step is going to be a congressional bill coming up. And that's what we are quite concerned about. It is not going to impact anybody else but Hindus, Hindu children, and the next generation. And in Britain, you have 2%. Hindus in America is only 0.7%, not even 1%. And jail population, of course, Hindus are not, you hardly see a Hindu person murdering and killing and in a killing spree or slaughtering. Talk to us about the 1871 Criminal Act. I was shocked to hear about that.
So two things you've raised. One is about the short term and what's going to happen with the Santa Clara issue, right? In order to defeat it, you need to make sure the community is aware of what the consequence will be. Okay? And the consequence will be this. If you are not a Dalit, if you are anybody who is deemed to be a part of this thing called the caste system, okay, if you're assumed to be not a Dalit, then any Dalit will be able to come into your organization and leverage an accusation and say, I was denied a promotion because I'm a Dalit, and this person is not a Dalit. If you're a doctor, and for whatever reason, I'll give you a very real example. Here in the United Kingdom, a Dalit goes to a doctor who is a Jat Sikh. The doctor diagnoses a condition and prescribes an injection and says, if you can see the nurse, she will arrange to give you the injection. The Dalit activist lodges a complaint at the hospital and says that this doctor did not want to give me the injection because I'm a Dalit and he is a high caste, and therefore I've been discriminated against. How do you defend against it if it's law? Yeah, this is going to happen. Every Hindu who is not a Dalit becomes vulnerable to the accusations of a mischievous Dalit activist. You have to then suddenly prove your innocence, not your guilt. The onus in law is that a person is presumed innocent unless proven guilty. What this will do is it will make the situation completely reversed for a Hindu. A Hindu will have to prove their innocence as opposed to have their guilt established. Isn't that an act of violence? That's an act against their human rights? But it will happen. It will happen. Now, in that particular case, the doctor was able to refer to the hospital policy where the hospital had established a program to train nurses to deliver and dispense injections. So he was able to show the policy, and as a result, that spurious claim would be rejected. But imagine if the hospital didn't have that policy. Now, this is the message you need to give to every single Hindu person. This is what the impact of this legislation will be. All the hard work that they're doing, Sundar Pichai at the height of Google or Microsoft or whatever he is, right? Google. He will be vulnerable to an allegation by anybody who wants to pull him down. And the Dalit doesn't have to be a Hindu. It can be a Dalit Christian who has been indoctrinated and brainwashed over 2 generations into believing that his ancestors were his enemies. That person can bring that allegation. This is not justice. So this is why I say it's bad law. But that is the message that you have to get across to our Hindu community, that this is what's intended to do. And just think what it will do. 2 generations of hard work in the United States, building businesses, building careers, building reputations, building political authority and contributions. You know, we've got our Hindus and people of Indian origin now becoming chief justices, you know, being scrutinized for being part of Supreme Court appointments, all these sorts of things. Each and every Hindu who is not a Dalit becomes vulnerable to being destroyed professionally and personally by a simple allegation of presumed guilt. That message you have to give to our community, because they have to wake up. And if they wake up, then you can start to add a bit of power to this voice. So this needs to be done. You mentioned the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. One of the things I needed to do was I needed to find out exactly when did this community, the Dalit community, appear? Where did they come from? Because historically we have many, many records, historical records, our own itihasa, but also records from non-Indian sources. Chinese philosophers used to come to Nalanda and to the universities to learn centuries ago, and never do they record the existence of a Dalit or an untouchable community. Megasthenes in his work Indica records 7 groups in society. He doesn't say there's a hierarchy. He doesn't say that there is power in the people at the top or anything like that, and the lower sections are oppressed. So where did they come from? And here's where the Dalit community, the oppressed, the crushed, as they call themselves, emerged. It was the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. So this was an act which was passed specifically giving the British administrators the power to designate any group as being a criminal tribe. And if you read the terms of this act, just think about how ridiculous the scenario is. You have a bunch of white Christian men sitting in the House of Lords, deciding how they can immediately deprive communities 6,000 miles away of their freedom, of their livelihood, of the dignity and the position in society that they have, just by the tick of a pen. Where was Jesus Christ and the gospel of Christ and, you know, love thy neighbor and all of that stuff? It wasn't, it was absent. They were determined to destroy society. And Lord Canning, he said that divide and rule worked for the Romans and it should work for us in India. All right. So it was clearly a policy. And what they did with this Criminal Tribes Act, they passed a law which said that a British magistrate sitting in India could designate any tribe as criminal. And the words are that they are born criminals, they are ancestrally criminals, they will always be criminals, and they will die criminals, and their children will be criminals. Okay. And so this sort of a tribe is a problem. And so we need a way of uplifting them. You know how they uplifted the Native Americans? Exactly the same on the other side of the world, 6,000 miles away. They needed a way of uplifting them. So what they did, in one session, 230 tribes in Madras and in West Bengal, in Bengal at the time, were just deemed to be criminal tribes. And here's what happened to them. When you were deemed to be a criminal tribe, you were confined to what is a concentration camp on the outskirts of villages and towns. You were not allowed to leave those confinements without the permission of a British appointed civil servant. He would give you a pass to say that you can leave. Your assets were seized. You were not given access to your ancestral livelihood, and you plunged to the depths of society when you can't do any work, you can't have any business, you can't have any trade, and it's proliferated that you are thieves by birth. What happens to you? You become crushed. There were 13 million. In 1947, there were 13 million recorded individuals who were living in concentration camps in India at the time of independence, as it's called. This is the genesis of the Dalits. They had no other way of sustaining themselves except doing the menial tasks that no other member of society would do. They were reduced to collecting carcasses. They became the people who became tanners, leather workers, jamars, and so on. And there was one tribe who I encountered in my research who were so trusted. They were the caravans, shall we say. They were the freight and the truck hauliers of that time. a manufacturer in Kolkata would give this tribe all of their production and say, can you take this to Agra? Can you take this to Delhi? Can you take it to other parts of the country where we've got customers who have ordered it? These tribes were entrusted with the safety of the movement of goods. And they would take them from one city to another, and then they would receive the payment, and they were entrusted to return and pay the manufacturer. So they were held in high regard. They were courageous people. They were staunch, solid members of the community, and they were held in high esteem. The British wanted to tax the movement of goods. So what they did is they just, with a tick of a pen, designated the whole tribe as being members of a criminal tribe. And thereby they lost their livelihood, and they were confined to these concentration camp-like arrangements, and they plunged. And this is the genesis of the Dalit community. They were created by an act of parliament in Britain. And what happened? Like the British were so successful, they rewrote history, and part of their divide and rule, they said, oh, your suppression is actually those Brahmins, the same Brahmins who weren't allowed to buy land in Punjab. In Punjab, they were denied the opportunity to buy land because the British wanted them as civil servants, as clerks. And so they passed laws in Punjab which said, okay, Jats can buy land, they'll be the owners there, but you Brahmins, no, you can't, you're not allowed to buy land, you have to be scribes. And then in another part of the country, you blame the Brahmins for the oppression that is being inflicted. After one generation, nobody knows. When you grow up in poverty, you don't know who it was who put you in that position. And if a powerful figure of authority teaches you to distrust those who actually supported you and recognized your nobility, you're going to accept it. This is how devious and pernicious and unpleasant the British occupation of Bharat was. It was evil. There is no doubt, there is no other word for it. It was evil. They set brother against brother. I think it's recorded in the Bible, doesn't it? Jesus says at one point, I have come to separate brother from brother, to come between mother and sister and mother and daughter, and so on and so forth. And that's exactly what they did. And so the vast majority of the untouchables, the downtrodden and the crushed were created by the British. And again, I produce the evidence in the book, and people I'm more than happy to have somebody go through the evidence and refute it and say, here are facts to the contrary. But the facts that I've unearthed and presented would lead me to come to this conclusion.
2,000 years of foreign invasion on a land which is richest made it to become the poorest. And these are the cult actually trying to tell us and Hindus that Hindus are uncivilized. Whoever is listening to this conversation, I'd like to make sure it's quite clear, it should be clear by now, that caste was a creation by British to rule and divide Hindus. And once somebody is poor, the first priority is survival. They're not interested in history. They're not interested, try to figure out who created what. Survival is the primary. That's when they were able to write, create a narrative and history, which is now taught in the globe, that caste is an Indian problem. And Isabel Wilkerson has the audacity to tie it to Hitler's Nazi genocide and play her race baiting card in United States. When did scheduled caste become Dalit group? I lived in India for 20 years. I've never heard about this particular term called Dalit.
You see, it's again one of the incredible, the skillful ways in which an evil person can manipulate words, okay? And this is what's been used time and time again. The principle is simple. You take an adjective and you create it into a noun. You take another adjective, you create it into a noun, and then you set the two nouns against each other. So let me give you an example. Brahmin is a person who teaches. a person who's devoted to the gathering and dispersal of wisdom and knowledge. Okay, so teaching is the key part of it, right? That's an adjective, it describes what the person does. But if you then take that and make it a noun and say a Brahmin is a group, okay, it's a group identity. And in fact, a Kshatriya is not somebody who can fight, but it's a group identity, and let's give it a name and call it a noun. This is the Kshatriya group, and this is the Brahmin group. You've then got identity politics. And then you can set one identity against the other, and that's what divide and rule is all about. If you really want to understand caste, you have to understand the mechanisms whereby divide and rule is used by warmongers. Okay? Once you understand how divide and rule works, then you understand the necessity for creating an identity, a group who can be labeled. And if they can be labeled, they can be promoted or they can be demoted. They can be manipulated, they can be directed, they can be diminished, they can be elevated, because it's a group identity. It becomes identity politics. And that's what was done. At no point in time was there a community called the Dalit community. It's an identity which described many group communities who were actually diminished and oppressed and were at the poverty levels of the Indian society. And what you do, if you're a manipulator of history and you're a master of divide and rule, is you give them a group identity. Rather than describing them as being poor, you would say they are the poor, and they become a group called the poor. And hence the group identity of the Dalit was created. For your viewers, here's an amazing example of how far down we were diminished. When the British came to Bharat, there were some 605 principalities or kingdoms. Over 400 were ruled by Shudra kings and queens. 400, that's the best part of 2/3 of the whole of the ruling class was of Shudras. Shudras were not poor people. Right? Rani Raj Mohini of Kolkata, she built Dakshineshwar Mandir. I've been to Dakshineshwar Mandir and I studied the history. She was a Shudra queen and she built a mandir. And Ramakrishna Paramahansa then fulfilled his life mission in Dakshineshwar Mandir. That same Dakshineshwar Mandir that inspired Swami Vivekananda. It was built by a Shudra queen. When the British left, the second largest landowner in Bharat was the church. So the biggest movement of land and assets was from the Shudra community to the church. The church plunged the Shudra community into poverty, and then in divide and rule politics, pointed the finger at the people who were the biggest threat to the missionaries, which were the teachers, the people who had been the custodians and the identity of Bharat for millennia, the ones who had the stories, the ones who had the itihasas, the ones who preserved Yoga Vidya, the ones who preserved the Ayurveda scriptures, the ones who preserved the Vedas. They were the high people because they were the highest threat to the British occupation of India, and especially to the missionary activities. That's why they were high caste. The only metric that works, I say to people, you say somebody's high caste, what's the metric? Is it the amount of money they've got? Is it the amount of land they own? What is the metric that you say this person is higher than that person? There is no consistent metric, because the Brahmins were not poor or were not rich. They were poor. Their commitment to a pious life demanded a level of poverty. They didn't have land. They weren't the rulers, because the Kshatriyas and the kings were rulers. What power did they have? What threatened the British was the power of knowledge. They had access to the knowledge that sustained and built this civilization, and it was a threat to the missionary movement. And so the caste system, high to low, the only metric that works is the threat to British occupation. The Brahmins were the highest threat, so they were designated the high caste, who were oppressing everyone else. The Shudras represented the least threat by the time the British had finished, and so they now became the low caste. The metric that is consistently applicable is threat to missionary activity, and that's why the Brahmins have been labeled as high caste. High threat.
Our Prime Minister Narendra Modi is not from high caste. He's a low caste person, and quote unquote, but he's the Prime Minister. Krishna, the creator of the entire universe, he was born in his avatar in Yadav, which is
You
not
see,
a high class either.
this is one of the skills of the barbarian, and that is to fill the bandwidth, right? It wasn't until 1938. 1930? No, I'm sorry. We had in Britain Margaret Thatcher as the first prime minister, and she was a woman. Okay, first woman prime minister. So late. We have a history of queens and leaders that goes back into antiquity. They don't have that in the West. They don't have it in Europe, right? We have sages who were women, who have scriptures in their name. You know, Gargi is famous, right? They don't have that in the West. They burnt their wise women at the stake. But if you want to conceal your own crimes and hide your own fearful insecurities, you're always pointing out the flaws in the others. Oh, they've got this. Oh, they've got sati. Oh, they've got caste. Oh, they worship cows, etc., etc. It's nothing other than propaganda. And because we are genuinely self-reflective people, you know, it's in our swadhyaya is in our blood. You know, we're always looking at ourselves. What else can I do to become better? And so when you meet somebody who is a professional critic, they bombard you. Oh, you've got this wrong. Oh, you've got that wrong. Oh, you should do this. Oh, you shouldn't do that. Let me save you here. Let me fix that for you. Oh, by the way, I'm from a poverty-stricken little island on the end of the world, and you produce 33% of the world's GDP. But let me teach you how to do it better. This is the scale of rank hypocrisy and evil that we faced. And we must recognize that the British were masters of broadcasting hypocrisy and lies. It was quite amazing. And our dear Rabindranath Tagore said it so well, that the British used to say that the British Empire was so vast that the sun never set on it. And to which Rabindranath Tagore responded saying, well, the reason the sun never sets on it is because not even God can trust the British in the dark.
I like that.
So this is the reputation of this stage of British history. You have to remember, the British colonized Ireland as well, and they did divide and rule politics on the Irish. They erased their pagan heritage. They have such a Punjabi Celtic identity. It's lovely. I have such good Irish friends, and I always look back on them and think it's on these Irish people that the English created the British identity by colonizing them. Divide and rule. There is Northern Ireland, which is loyal to Britain. There is Southern Ireland, which is challenging that. It's a classic British policy. Divide and rule, create a border, create friction between the two. And you can always be the monkey in the middle who is saying, oh, you should try this and you should try that. And oh, let me help you become peaceful. Oh, by the way, can you pay me your taxes?
Which is what they have done to North India and South India, India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine. No matter where you go, it's the same thing.
You know, I mentioned to you that the British colonialist identity, they present it as Mary Poppins or Nanny McPhee. And when you scratch deep enough behind the surface, there is the Hannibal Lecter, the cannibal identity. But in between, there's also a bumbling, fumbling Captain Mannering sort of an identity, which is whose ambitions leave their competence so far behind. There is a trail of devastation around the globe wherever the British interfered and manipulated their social engineering. It left suffering on a scale which is just, it leaves a person speechless once you know what it was. And we're all trying to recover from that. And as I said, humanity taken as a whole, as one family, is in such a terrible state because of the manipulation and mischief caused by the British colonialist identity. And that British colonialist identity was purely based upon the churches of empire. And that's a fact of history.
And we have a lot of English babus within us now, unfortunately.
Yeah, but it's not, you know, I have a great deal of confidence in the momentum that was given to our civilization because of generations of rishis and sadhus and sannyasis. And I am sure that when people who are of Bharatiya origin truly understand the possibility, accept the possibility that they are dancing to somebody else's tune, that their whole life was mapped out by somebody who was evil, that in fact, not only was the land colonized, but their life was colonized, their thoughts were colonized, their name was colonized, that they are an occupied being, they will then start to realize, and the opportunity for them to consider that they're suffering an act of violence will arise in their thoughts. When they understand that their life was pushed onto a different track to what it was meant to have been, I'm confident that they will start to search their history. And when they become aware of the history, we will see Gharvapsi on a huge scale. Nobody likes their whole life to have been usurped by somebody else who wanted to suck you of your life essence for their own particularly malicious motives. Nobody wants to be a part of that fraud. It's only a question of time before people begin to realize that they have been taken advantage of. And innocent people are actually easy to take advantage of. You know, Bharatiyas, because of our closeness to being such spiritual people, it's a commonly accepted principle in all esoteric traditions that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to become like a child. You need to have the innocence of a child. And the thing about children is they are innocent. Bharat is full, even now, of such innocent people. The tribals are genuinely dharmic, but they are genuinely innocent. And they are vulnerable to the scurrilous tricks and devious games played by manipulative, malicious missionaries. And that's what's happened. So many of our innocent people have been completely manipulated, psychologically gaslit and manipulated to such a degree that their lives are no longer their own. They're following somebody else's dream for global domination without even knowing that they are unwitting pawns in such a scheme. It's only a question of time. No, Satyam evam jayate, as they say, or as St. Augustine said, he said, the truth doesn't need defending. It's a lion. All you need to do is release it. And that's what we have to do. We have to release the truth. And then, as St. Augustine said, it will do what it needs to do.
Do you think the organization behind this Santa Clara County resolution and what happened in Britain, are they pawn too?
You know, I said to you that those who are evil, who are the custodians of this evil design, they are masters of manipulation. Right? Just think, for the best part of 280 years, they siphoned and stripped assets from Bharat, plunging the whole nation into poverty. And then they used the funds that were taken from Bharat to go back and give charity and say, let us give you a bag of rice if you convert, right? Look at these terrible things that have happened to you. We can help you in your suffering. Right? These are the most cunning white devils, I think they were called once upon a time by the Native Americans when they first encountered them. And there is nothing but malice there. But the answer to this is knowledge. Once people become more fully aware of the history of religion, as opposed to the nonsense and the beliefs that religion peddles, the history reveals everything. Right the way from Hypatia and the purges around Europe, the pogroms against the Native Americans, the aggression against the Jews. Remember, Hitler was a devoted Christian. His records and his diaries, they say, I am a Christian through and through, and everything I'm doing is I'm pursuing the mission of the Christ against the people who killed Christ. You know, there's a blood libel against the Jewish people. They were the ones who killed Christ. And it was a trope. It's a lie. It's one of those malicious rumors, as a result of which multiple generations of the Jewish community were actually vilified, dehumanized, and attacked. And that's how it was justified, on the basis of a trope. And in the same way, Hindus are being attacked on the basis of a lie, another colonialist lie established by Christianists.
One last question. So caste was a creation by British to divide and conquer India and Hindus. At the same time, it was not our system, our social structure was not based on birth. So how did they convert that Varna system into birth-based hereditary caste system?
In order to undermine a religion, you have to vilify it. So you've identified that you have to break the jatis in order to convert people. But that's not enough, because the jatis is nothing to do with religion. That's to do with social capital. It's to do with the manner in which a society preserves the knowledge it's acquired and passes it on to the next generation. That's what a jati is. It's a container for knowledge capital, nothing to do with the religion. But if you want to destroy the religion, you have to be able to at least hang some sort of poisonous garland around it and say, this is how evil it is. In the Shastra, we have the notion of 4 Varnas, Chatur Varna. Okay. In the Gita, Krishnaji says, I have created 4 Varnas. Okay. Now, Varna is aptitude. It's crystal clear. The word Var is, we find it in variety. We find it in variation, right? And what it means is when you have a range of things and you select one of them, or you work on one from many, is what Varna means. In the most common understanding, it's color. You know, you have multiple colors. The rainbow, Varnmala, right? We have Varnmala, we have the alphabet, which is a collection, it's a necklace of sounds, right? It's a scale of multiple varied sounds. So anything where there's a variation, a difference, a range, we refer to it as Varna. And when Paramatma says, I have created 4 Varnas, he is saying that by and large, in the English language, we would say there are 4 archetypes, right? There are scholarly people. There are courageous warrior-like people who want to defend and, impose justice and protect the realm and all of that stuff. And then there are people who are merchants by nature. They're skillful at generating resources and creating wealth. They're the economists, they're the people who can organize a society's assets so that the society is protected, nourished, and sustained for a long period of time. And then you have simple people who are actually pure of heart, and they just want an honest day's pay for an honest day's labor, and they're not particularly interested in reading through the books. They're actually pure of heart and mind. And Shudra and Shuddhi is the same root. And that's the archetypes. And the scriptures say that here they are. And then you have in between the jati manipulation that the missionaries wanted to do and the Varna, which is recorded, you have a pipeline, you have a funnel of Europeans reducing 1,300 jatis into 4 castes over a period of censuses. And then they said the castes are Brahmins, and they're terrible, and because they hate us and because they undermine and prevent, there are records which say, missionaries say, that if it wasn't for the Brahmins, we would have converted this, right? And the Brahmins were saying, well, we work on Vidya, right? No, I'm sorry, the earth goes around the sun. No matter what you say, right, that is asat, and we're not going to abandon sat. And so they were a threat. And so you say they're the high caste and they're oppressing all of the others. It's just classic divide and rule from there onwards. But what you have done is you have attached a horrific social structure which you created, and you've now blamed the religious scriptures for that. And you wipe out everything in between. And then you run around the world so that even somebody sitting in South Dakota, Sioux Falls, or Charlottesville, even they have heard of caste. How is this possible? In the remotest places. I was in Charlottesville once and I went to have a haircut. This is from the time when I had more hair. And I was chatting with the hairdresser and she said, oh, you have a lovely accent. Where are you from? And I said, I'm from England. And she said, oh, is that England in London? Okay. So even in places where they don't even know that London actually is inside of England, even in those remote places, they have heard of the Hindu caste system. Why? Because clerics proliferated all of this thing right across the globe in every corner, even in Charlottesville, so that people would automatically have the first step taken to challenge, to vilify, and dehumanize the Hindus. This is by
It's
policy. This is not an accident of fate that everybody has heard of the terrible Hindu caste system. It's an act of propaganda worthy of Goebbels himself.
quite interesting. You mentioned how toolkit was shared with the church, the nexus of church, and everybody knows about the caste they created.
Correct.
I know it's late in London, but if you have a little bit of time, I have one last question for you. No conversation of caste can be finished without talking about Manusmriti, or the rule of law of Manu. It has been completely colonized, defamed. How did they do it? And how they were able to be so successful implementing that? I'd never heard about Manusmriti until now. So this isn't the book that normal Hindus even read. Hindus don't even read Gita, even though it is the book.
So,
Manusmriti.
wonderful question, wonderful question. Before doing what most Hindus do, which is to defend Manusmriti, okay? And I'm not suggesting for a moment that Manusmriti is as flawed as people would paint it to be. I'm not suggesting that. But what I'm just going to do is step back for a moment and look at the nonsensical logic here, okay? The Old Testament is a horrific book. It is one of the most violent books, full of the most pernicious, horrific human rights abuses one can imagine. But we don't go around saying to Christians, oh, you're like this because your scripture says that. Therefore, you are still saying that if your daughter has an adulterous affair, then you should drag her and beat her on the threshold of your home. We don't say that you're doing that. So where does the logic come in that you can point a finger at any Hindu and say, because of Manusmriti, right, you are therefore guilty? Where does that logic come in? Isn't that an unequal positioning? Isn't that whitewashing? That whatever is Christian is okay and can be looked at seriously and said, no, there's a historical gap there, etc., etc. Even though we take the Old Testament and put our hand on it in a court of law and say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God, right? The Hindus don't do that with Manusmriti, right? But there is a hypocrisy here. And if you are going to apply one set of, shall we say, judgments to studying one scripture, one community, one society, one ancient document, then you have to take the same approach. And I would like to, any Christian who wants to talk to me about Manusmriti, I would say, great, let's have a bipartisan sort of conversation. I will answer all your questions about Manusmriti, but you have to answer all of my questions about the Code of Theodosius, the Theodosian Code. Now, Theodosius, he was a Roman emperor who was responsible. Constantine formulated the Bible at the Council of Nicaea, and then Theodosius, he was the one who proliferated it and made it the state religion of the whole of the Roman Empire. And he created something called the Theodosian Code, and it's horrific. It is barbaric. But that was the basis upon which the Christian religion spread throughout Rome, the Roman Empire. So I always say to people, well, let's do it properly. I'll bring the Code of Theodosius, you bring a copy of the Manusmriti, and let's have a genuine interfaith conversation, and nobody ever takes me up on it. All right, so firstly, if we're going to talk about Manusmriti, let's do it as equals, as academics, looking at history and acknowledging human foibles and everything else. Secondly, having said that, now I'm going to do what most Hindus do, which is to say, defend Manusmriti. One, it is not a scripture that we are bound by. Here is something that Europeans and indeed Muslims don't understand. We are not required to follow our scriptures. Right? Our experience, our teaching is that the human is his own scripture. That don't cause suffering, but learn from your experiences. And by the end of life, you are a walking, talking, living scripture. You yourself are the best guide to how to navigate humanity, and you should pass those lessons on. We're not required to follow a scripture. There is no, I mean, even in the Gita, at the end of it, Arjun says to Sri Krishna, he says, tell me what to do. You know, you spent 17 chapters and now it's all over. The 18th chapter is here. I understand everything, but please tell me what to do. And even in that situation, Paramatma says to him, Yata ichasi tata kuru. do what your inner guidance tells you to do. Whatever your Ichha Shakti is making you do, just go ahead and do that. But do something. That's it. He didn't say, but do something. But that's what he meant. And I say this to often Hindus. I say, look, do something. Knowing, talking is not doing. We have to do something. So the first thing and the first rebuttal is we are not bound by any written text. For us, there are merely guidelines to be taken as advisory, and karma comes in. We learn from karma. Now, if you want to, you have the choice of accepting that there were very wise souls who wrote scriptures, the scriptures which have satisfied the test of time, and those wise people follow. So there are people who will follow the Vedas and who revere the guidance that's inside of them. And remember, they are not lightweights. These books are the most amazingly encrypted works that you can imagine. But they're written in sutra form, so that just getting hold of the book is not enough. You need to have somebody who is part of the parampara and the lineage, who's been initiated, who can then unpack the sutra. It's like having a zip file, right? All of our scriptures are written in zip file format, and you need to be able to unzip it and then have somebody expand it and read it to you and explain it to you. That's a route that people take, but there is no requirement which says this is what you must do. And so that undermines the notion that Manusmriti is the bedrock of our teachings and that we're guilty of anything that may be in there which is problematical. So having said all of that, I'm still going to defend Manusmriti because it's one of the texts which European scholars have accepted was hugely adulterated by the British when they came in, because they needed to prove that the Hindus were barbaric by design and by scripture. Now, if you have a look at the Manusmriti, there is no mention of caste in there. If somebody can find the mention of caste in there, I think a friend of mine has actually put up a reward of 5 lakh rupees to the person who can bring a copy of the Manusmriti which is valid and which contains the references to caste. Okay? And the vast majority of people who say Manusmriti, they haven't read it. They run around saying Manusmriti. You know, it's like that little group of very poor, hugely embarrassed Pakistani scholars who always say, well, the United Nations passed a resolution that Kashmir belongs to Pakistan. Actually, it doesn't. And they didn't. And nobody has read the resolution, but they all talk about it. It's the same with Manusmriti. Nobody has read it. Nobody has understood it. Nobody has established the veracity or indeed the provenance of the version that they're reading. And yet they all talk about it.
Translated by British themselves.
Adulterated.
I like that better.
There's one last point which you raised, which I think is quite important. That was by birth.
Yes.
Okay. Now everyone points the finger about Varna by birth. Do I talk about this? Yes. Okay, I will talk about this. Okay. Remember, according to our yoga philosophy, our Jyotish science, right, both of which are hugely criticized by the West, right, and slowly being appreciated by the most serious scholars of the West as actually having foundations. In those, we say that the planets have an influence upon the aptitude of a person at the birth. Right? The grahas influence the guna composition, and the guna composition guides the appearance of the varna. Right? So at birth, the confluence, the configuration of the planets imposes a certain set of aptitudes and inclinations on the body. And then a jivatma comes to occupy that body and bringing with them prarabdha karma, the momentum of karma of past lives comes and unites with the varna, the guna composition which is formed at birth, and then a jivatma, a manushya, appears on the planet. Okay. But here's something that most people overlook, and that is that varna in the same family can be different. So a child is born under one muhurat, shall we say, under one combination, and he will have a Brahmin varna. Another child in the same family is born at a different time under different influences, and he will have a Shudra Varna. And another one will have a Kshatriya Varna. And another daughter may be born and she will have a business mind and a Vaishya Varna. So in one family, you can have multiple Varnas, and you do. Okay. So somebody says to me, Satish, you're a Brahmin caste. Your Varna is Brahmin. And I say, no, if you look at my Janam Patrika, it says that my Varna is Kshatriya. And if you want to fight about it, I'm ready to have a fight about it because I'm a Kshatriya Varna. So it makes a nonsense of this notion of hereditary Varnas. There's a difference. People do not draw the distinction between hereditary and birth. Right? A Brahmin does not automatically give birth to a Brahmin. But somebody who is born into a Brahmin kul, a Brahmin jati, is born into a group of people who have made it their life's mission to preserve knowledge. And so when a person is born into a kul, the teaching is that you should do what your kul does because you are now into that kul, you have the benefit of all of this vidya. Right? Or if you are born into a different kul, you're born into a Vaishya parampara, then make money, participate in that kul, preserve the capital that's preserved across this time, and make sure it's passed on because it can be used to serve society. When you have the need for a kul to be defended, then you get people of Kshatriya Varna born into non-Kshatriya kuls. At times when Brahma Vidya needs to be protected, and maybe the Kshatriya Varna has become corrupted by Vaishya Parampara instincts, and they become too attached to their jewels and their diamonds, their thrones and their courtiers and their white horses, and they start to thinking, bas hum hi hai, hamari puja kijiye, that sort of thinking. Then what happens is you get different Varnas born into different kuls because they have to be resolved. You get Parsuramji, a Kshatriya, born into a Brahmin kul, so he can be given all of the knowledge that's necessary for him then to influence society, to reset, so that harmony is restored. So this is really huge scale thinking. Our rishis were vast in the manner that they understood humanity. And in all of that, there is nothing rigid. And yoga abhyas is the sadhana that you can do to become free of all of those and become Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. If you want to do sadhana, it doesn't matter what your kul was, it doesn't matter what your parampara was, it doesn't matter what your varna was, it doesn't matter what your jati was. The moment that switch flips in your mind, that ye sansar isme kuch nahi hai, right? When that moment comes and you do sadhana, you leave all of that behind, which is why sannyasis are freed of all of the social structures. And so when people try and reduce such a wonderful, intricate, holistic, fluid system into caste, right? It's an act of violence. And we can be generous and say they do this because of ignorance. We can be generous and say that they do this because of the effects of colonized manipulation. But we have to be generous only to a point, not to the point where we will say we will accept our own obliteration just to maintain the facade that we're nice, civilized people who don't thump back. You know, Kshatriyas are there for a purpose. So I hope that's cleared up the confusion that arises when people talk about birth and heredity. This is the difference.
And we also have Gotra. We also have Gotra that comes from the rishis and to make sure that there is no birth defects and etc., which is now nowadays in modern world is thrown out as a superstitious
activity. It used to be, but it has changed now because we have learned the language of European scientific disciplines. It's now universally agreed that the adherence to a Gotra system protects the Y chromosome. It prevents the one thing which will ensure diversity in human form from becoming extinct. It protects the Y chromosome. This is what Gotra does. And there are papers that have been written on it, and people can consult that. But there was another idea, which was a lovely idea behind the Gotras, and that was that each rishi had a particular type of knowledge. And in his kul, he would pass on that darshan that he'd received. And that the recipients, the members of that kul, who accepted him as a kul guru, they would preserve that knowledge. So if you are from a gotra, a rishi gotra, which was, let's say, they preserved Ayurveda, the knowledge of healing, okay? And then you had somebody who is from Parsuram gotra, shall we say, which is Kshatriya Tattva. You wouldn't mix the two gotras because there'd be confusion. They would say, right, keep the two gotras apart. Now, whether you like it or you don't like it, whether you agree or you disbelieve it, it doesn't really matter. There was a darshan which said that a human being and a genealogy, a parampara, can be devoted to preserving a particular branch of wisdom. You know, we have gharanas who preserve musical traditions, right? And so you wouldn't want to mix those musical traditions. If you wanted to preserve the height of each of those, you would say, right, you've received an incredible benefit from your ancestors, your lineage. Now you preserve this one. That lineage will preserve that one. This lineage and parampara will preserve this body of knowledge. And so you maintain multiple schools of knowledge, and the whole of society benefits. But when you get somebody who is a divide and rule master, they will come and say, yeah, you tabla guys, you've been discriminated against by the sitar guys for so long, you know, unka band bajao. You know, and this is what happens with somebody who wants to steal. They come and they create an identity, and then identity politics is the basis of divide and rule.
Right. So whoever is listening to this conversation today, I'd like you to keep in mind what we have learned today. First of all, caste was a creation of British, wanted to divide and rule India and Hindus. And since then, they have taken that creation of their to entire world to demonize Hindus. Today, Hindus are only 3% in the entire world, except in India. 97% of Hindus are in India and Nepal. And if caste is added as a separate protected category here in United States, it is going to lay the path for another Hindu genocide right here in United States. And Pandit Satish ji has worked tirelessly to stop UK from doing so in London. Today, we are at the same stage of fighting caste, the same way race has been used recently in the United States to break United States. I hope you understand the difference between caste and class. House of Lords and House of Commons is a beautiful example of the class wars.
Yep.
House of Commons was made for the regular people.
The common people even.
Common people, right, common people. And that concept, European concept, was enforced on Hindus. At the end time when British left India, it left a country naked, almost dead. Today, after 75 years, India is still trying to stand on her own feet, unable to do so because it has been ruled by communists and socialist regimes, still trying hard to eradicate Hindus from the world. But if you go little bit in the history, you will find Hinduism was everywhere, even in Turkey, even in Iraq, Iran. They have been completely eradicated. One question that always comes back again and again, how come Hinduism survived? How did Hindus survive even after all this? Maybe we'll have a conversation on that later on, but one simple answer for that is Hinduism doesn't have one book, one scripture, one indoctrination. It is experiential. You don't have to even follow any particular scripture. And that's probably why Hinduism survived, and everybody else, all the indigenous faiths are in the museum right now. We are talking about caste in India, how it was implemented and created so successfully, because Hindus today are faced an act of violence by America in the land of America, trying to describe that Hindus of India brought caste system to America. I've lived half of my life in India, half of my life in America. I've never heard of this, or nobody asked me in my professional career or in India as I was growing up what my caste is. Today, I'm forced to learn about my own caste and also teach my children. And one day in America, they have to walk around with a card, an identity card of their caste, which has nothing to do with who they are. That's the danger we are facing in America. Just a few short years ago, Britain had gone through. British Indians like Satish ji has done fabulous work since then to educate, also have a book in front of us. I would like every Christian, every Hindus to read this book so we know what we are up against. Thank you, Satish ji. It was a pleasure talking to you, learning so much about our own history, which is not taught in our books in India. And it is my pleasure that we are able to bring this content at least to America. Well, we'll try to, because we have been suppressed in all social media. I have been permanently suspended in LinkedIn. Twitter shadow banned me, and YouTube, we don't know when it's going to be taken off. I'm sure they're monitoring. WhatsApp, Facebook keeps on blocking me multiple times. I was just released just a day ago. It has been a journey so far, but truth must be told. And that's why I'm here, and we'll continue to bring quality conversation to the world. We'll see where that goes.
Wonderful. In conclusion, Purnima ji, if I can just thank you for your work. As I said, I have never intended to do this. I was quite happy with my simple little life, reading my books and doing my sadhana, but it was the necessity of the time. And please, anybody who is watching this, recognize that this is the necessity of your time. It's required for you to face this issue and to deal with it now. Otherwise, all of the hard work that you're putting into building a life for yourself and a future for your children, it will disappear in one court case against one of your children, and then it'll be too late. So Purnima ji is one of those who obviously has understood the depth of this and the severity of this, and has decided to personally commit to preventing it from happening. But on her own, she will not be enough. And so please, I would suggest to everybody and ask everybody, become informed, gather the information, and use this as an opportunity to bind the community together, to bring it closer together, and to make this change for everybody's benefit. This is bad law, and bad law harms everyone. So Purnima ji, thank you for the opportunity to speak with your audience and with your friends and community. And if anybody does need to, please get in touch. I'm on Twitter, I am for the moment, at The British Hindu. And I'd be delighted to answer any further questions. And I hope that we have an opportunity in the future to have further conversations. So thank you very much. Om Guru Bhyo Namaha. And best of luck to you with your efforts. Thank you, Purnima ji.
Thank you for your support, help, and guidance. We'll be in touch.
Om.
Om.